Hello and welcome everybody to the webinar 100 Days of War in Ukraine, Narratives and Response. Bonjour et j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à tout le monde au webinaire 100 jours de guerre en Ukraine, narratifs et réponses. Donc pour commencer, to start, we will start with some little bit of housekeeping items. So the first thing that I'd like to mention is that this is a bilingual event, which means that interpretation services are available. You just need to select them at the bottom of your screen, either English or French. We will not be having a Q&A session at the end, but you can still use the chat in case a technical issue arises, or if you'd like to interact or give some type of response. In case you get kicked out for any technical reason and cannot access the webinar and need to come back in, my colleague Rita will be putting her email address and you can send her an email directly. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Cooperation Canada's CEO, Kate Higgins, who will give a few words of introduction. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, everyone. It's really excellent to be here. It's really thrilling to see such a fantastic lineup of speakers. To start off, I would like to acknowledge that today I am joining you from Winnipeg. This land is Treaty 1 territory and the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And the water here is sourced from the Shoal Lake 40 Nation. This place is located at the juncture of Red and Assiniboine rivers that have been a meeting place for over 6,000 years. And it is in fact near the geographical center of Turtle Island. As we discuss war and the violent takeover of land today, I encourage us all to reflect on Canada's violent and oppressive past and present, and the concrete actions those of us that are settlers must take to reconcile with Indigenous peoples whose lands and water we benefit from today. As we pass the 100-day mark of the war in Ukraine, the devastation this war has caused is truly shocking. 15,000 people dead, far more wounded, 6 million refugees, 1.5 million people displaced internally, 4.8 million jobs lost, and at least $100 billion in damages to infrastructure. There are humanitarian, economic, and security imperatives to respond to, and we do need to take bold and brave action. Parallèlement, nous sommes confrontés à une crise alimentaire mondiale aux proportions effrayantes. Par exemple, dans la corne de l'Afrique, le nombre de personnes souffrant de la faim en phase crise ou pire a plus que doublé par rapport à l'année dernière, atteignant 23 millions de personnes. Le danger que représente cette urgence est évident. Les Nations Unies prévoient que 350 000 enfants somaliens pourraient mourir au cours de l'été 2022 si des mesures immédiates ne sont pas prises. Ces deux crises sont liées, mais les réponses et les narratifs des gouvernements, du public, des philanthropies, des médias ont été très différents. We are here together today to discuss this war in Ukraine and the resulting humanitarian emergency and response, and the action that Canada has taken in light of this crisis. How has the humanitarian community responded to this emergency? Has the global community demonstrated its commitment to localization? And has the global community put power and resources in the hands of the organizations, communities, and activists on the ground? What has Canada done? And does Canada's actions reflect its commitment to feminist foreign policy? But today, in our time together, we also want to do more. How has racism and inequality shaped the response in Ukraine? And what do the different responses to the war in Ukraine on the one hand and other significant crises in other parts of the world say about Canadian and global priorities, interests, and concerns when faced with humanitarian emergencies and geopolitical crises? How do we grapple with the systemic racism that exists in the systems, organizations, and narratives that shape our responses to crisis? Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui afin de tout décortiquer et nous sommes dépendants d'un groupe d'intervenants exceptionnel pour le faire. J'ai vraiment hâte d'écouter, d'apprendre et de réfléchir au dialogue que nous aurons aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup, and I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Kate. And I am also very excited to be able to introduce our wonderful speakers. Notre premier panéliste, c'est Thomas Bauer. Thomas est président et directeur général de SOS Village d'Enfants Canada. Il est un dirigeant d'ONG qui est à la fois stratégique et dynamique et qui possède plus de 20 ans d'expérience dans les domaines de la protection de l'enfance, du développement international, de la gestion des organisations à but non lucratif et de la gouvernance. Donc, un gros bienvenue à Thomas. Gabriel Bardal. So, as Vice President of External Relations, Gabriel Bardal advances the Parliamentary Centre's role as Canada's global leader for democracy by nourishing strategic partnerships, designing state-of-the-art programs, and zeroing in on the human impacts of the Parliamentary Centre's global programs. Dr. Bardal has also previously provided elections and democracy advising grounded in gender equality and empowerment. So welcome. Aisha Francis est la directrice générale de Kairos, Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiatives, et préside EVA's Initiatives for Homeless Youth. Elle est une auteure et une professionnelle chevronnée avec plus de 25 ans d'expérience diversifiée en leadership et en affaires et une solide expérience dans les questions de justice raciale. Donc, bienvenue à Aisha. Natalia Karboska has more than 25 years of experience in development work. Since 1997, she has been working in the area of civil society development and women's rights. Natalia is the co-founder and director of strategic development of the Ukrainian Women's Fund, the only women's fund in Ukraine. So welcome, Natalia, and welcome to all of our speakers. Very excited to hear your reflections on our themes. And I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, who is the policy lead at Cooperation Canada. So please welcome Karel Mangbenza.
Thank you, Darren. Can you hear me okay? Thank you to all of you, to all our panelists. Bienvenue à tous. Comme Kate l'a dit dans son introduction, cela fait plus de 100 jours que la Russie a lancé sa guerre en Ukraine. Et le plus récent bilan des Nations Unies fait état de milliers de morts civiles et militaires depuis le 24 février. Et ça, c'est sans compter les blessés. Malheureusement, le bilan est loin d'être définitif. Though this crisis is still unfolding and sadly, we have to say, prolonging, I would like to start with the lessons that we are learning already from the global humanitarian response to the war. I'd like to start with you, Natalia. But first of all, how are you?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, and well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, to participate in such an important meeting. Actually, you asked her how I am. When I saw the title of today's event, I was thinking about myself, and it resonates. This 100 days resonates a lot with me, and this number is very symbolic for me, actually, because this is the number of days that I was IDP, internally displaced person. My family and I returned home to Kiev just 5 days ago, and today is 106th day of war. So I do hope that there will be no need to repeat this experience.
Thank you, Natalia.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And it's important to keep this very personal because we're talking about human tragedies, not just geopolitics and humanitarian response, but these are people, and Natalia is just one of many, too many. Natalia, many of us observed how Ukrainian citizens came together, bonded together since the invasion in February. In fact, many local organizations, including your organization, the Ukrainian Women's Fund, have been active even before, since 2014, when the Crimea crisis unfolded. So how would you describe how in this current crisis, how the Ukrainian civil society responded and self-organized in the current crisis? And maybe also how the civil society dealt with the global influx of support?
Yeah, well, I recently, thank you for the question. It's really an excellent question, especially for someone who deeply believes in the power of civil society. I think I'm hearing the echo.
This is,
Okay,
the echo has stopped, so I think you can.
Okay. Indeed, civil society in Ukraine is responded basically from the first days, from the first hours of war. And well, more specifically, I will talk about women's rights organizations that are working 24/7, basically supporting women, providing food and medicine, healing the trauma and giving strength to continue living to those women whose lives were destroyed by this war. Those who have been raped by Russian soldiers, those whose kids were killed, whose houses were burned. In terms of course, our strategies changed in response to the situation. Well, this is not something new for us, exactly as you said. We have been working with internally displaced people. We have been working in war since 2014, since the occupation of Crimea and parts of Eastern Ukraine, but definitely, it is now in a different scale, much bigger scale. So what organizations are doing is, first of all, we are providing humanitarian support to IDPs. Many of them, as we know, women and children. And you cannot even imagine the conditions that many IDPs live in now in Ukraine. I know this from my own experience. I saw them. The big challenge is that these women do not have jobs, they do not have money, and livelihood options for them are limited to humanitarian assistance distributed at the moment, still mostly by, not unfortunately by international humanitarian organizations, but mostly by volunteers and women's rights groups. And I'm talking specifically about grassroots locations, about small towns and villages in Ukraine. You can see humanitarian donors in big, regional centers, but unfortunately not in the regions. Another key area that organizations are working in is prevention of trafficking. We discussed already that there is a huge number of refugees, again, women, crossing the border without relatives, with language barriers, with no savings in the banks, just she, her kids, and the suitcase. And they are very dependent on those who offer help to them. So there is a huge risk of trafficking, and we are already observing the cases. So organizations are providing informational support, both organizations in Ukraine and also our sister organizations in the countries that are receiving refugees. They're organizing hotlines and other types of support. Another important topic is sexual violence, especially in the temporary occupied territories. Unfortunately, due to the occupation, there are no effective mechanisms of protection there. There is, unfortunately, sexual violence is a shame crime. In Ukraine, it's considered by survivors as a shame crime, and they are not ready to talk openly about their stories. The estimate number of cases is around 500 already. Often women's organizations, women activists are those who are the first respondents, those who provide psychological support, emergency contraceptions, and other support. So organizations are really working 24/7, and they are themselves at the point of burnout, because they cannot stop, because many people depend on them. The situation is rapidly changing in Ukraine. Of course, we cannot really plan much these days, but we try to adopt and try to be as effective and as fast in response as possible. Just a few words about my organization, Ukrainian Women's Fund. During the first week of the war, we launched rapid response grants. We think it's extremely useful mechanism. Now, as of today, we provided 82 grants to women's rights organizations at the occupied territories, temporarily occupied territories, and also at the other territories. And we do not stop this program because we see that there is a need. We provide grants which are a combination of humanitarian assistance and development, because we do think it's important now to start thinking about the future, about the systems. It is also important to support activists and organizations' resilience, and this is what we do with organizational support grants and capacity building grants. And of course, civil society is working a lot on strengthening the networks, formal and informal, but we think it is critically important now to be together for us and to support each other.
Thank you very much, Natalia. You mentioned what happened from the onset of the war, immediately when the invasion started. I'd like to turn to you, Aisha. About a week after the invasion, Kairos, your organization, issued a peace statement. And in that statement, Kairos called for an immediate end to all acts of war, and Natalia just spoke to some of them, including the heinous sexual crimes. But in your statement, you refer to stopping all acts of war and aggression. What are some of the lessons that Kairos is learning already about peace building, about restoring peace in Ukraine, and how has the war steered your work on human rights?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation today. I think it's an important conversation, and thank you for welcoming Kairos's voice as part of that. So I think one of the main things that we're learning, and this is also undergirded by the work that Kairos has been doing with women, peace and security and migrant justice for several years now. But of course, there's always this balance between this need for an immediate response to what's happening, balanced with or supported with a longer term vision of what change is needed for both systemic concern, societal, political, economic, and so on and so forth. So there's always this balance. And those are some of the lessons that, are important as we think about this piece about peace building. As Natalia really spoke to and pointed out, the harshest realities of war are often experienced by women and girls, gender diverse and racialized groups. And this is not to discount the other experiences or traumas that are experienced by other groups, but it's the truthful context of war. And it's these very challenging circumstances that irreversibly change the lives and livelihoods of women, girls, and gender diverse people. So what do you learn from that moment is that while there needs to be a responsiveness to everybody, there should be a very specific response to protecting women and ensuring that they have stability, that they are being supported, that they have access to resources, that they have access to protection, and that where they can, such as with organizations like Natalia, are able to participate in relief efforts and looked to as the ones that can do that work and be supported with all of the resources that they need to do that. Also, we've seen in this war an intensification of racism that continue to sort of affront human dignity, rights, and justice. And so as we look at the peace building, we need to look at aspects of what does that mean? for being displaced and being racialized and displaced. And what does that mean when it comes to crossing borders and opening of borders and the scrutiny that happens there, and how do we engage in ensuring that there is really, for peace building, we really have to embed everything that we are doing in all of the policies, all of the protocols with a strong anti-racist lens. We have to center and be very conscientious that we are dealing with humans, people, and center humanity in our peace building efforts, and really hold countries and leaders and workers, and whether they're frontline all the way up to all levels, hold them accountable for centering humanity and focusing on that and the need for people and their needs to be met. As part of this as well, there certainly is a need to respond to mental health crises when you are traumatized, when you're dealing with war, when you're dealing with all of this displacement and death and danger and destruction all around you. There is a need to respond to that. And so putting those pieces in place to support people. And again, I think it all goes back to the resources, but really, I think when I think about what have we learned, the responsibility doesn't just sit with one group or one sector. There needs to be a integrated, concerted effort at all levels. So from the government down to organizationally and institutionally, all the way down to communities and grassroots. And there needs to be a way for us to integrate all of those pieces together. Because when I think about, and it's national and international. And so when I think about these pieces, I think about in the immediate, that if a family is going through this moment, it might be the mother who provides the most stability for her family and children, right, in that moment. And while on a bigger lens, as we are leaders of our organizations and we're issuing these statements and calling for an end to war, and that is really targeted to governments and leaders, in that moment, the mother might be the person who's providing the most stability. And so there's this levels, all these levels that have to come together, and they're all integrated, and there needs to be a responsive effort to all of those to ensure that we have peace building. And I know in a moment of war, it is often hard to talk about the way that we can communicate between all of those levels, but being able to hear the stories and to be honest in our reporting of the narratives and keeping our ears to the ground as much as we're keeping it at the top levels is incredibly important to, again, moving peace building efforts forward. How has this war steered our work? I think that, again, Kairos has been doing a lot of work around particularly women, peace and security, mostly concentrated in the global south and migrant justice work. But I think as we look at the war in the Ukraine, it again forces us to think about the different power dynamics that are at play, the way that we as an organization can put some emphasis, and in the way that we are approaching our work, speak to stuff like the feminist foreign policy and contribute to how that policy is developed and other policies that we continue to advocate for. I also think that it forces us to look at and think through deeper layers of issues. So again, the issues are never black and white, they're compounded and they're layered. And so as an organization, we are constantly needing to think about what does it mean to cross a border? How do we ensure that there are all these aspects of respect with resources, with rights for individuals that are going through a situation of war who may become displaced or may become refugees, and how do we advocate for that, but then also create the resources and the space for those pieces. So I think that's how it's informing Kairos's work and helping us to build out additional capacity within our organization and also supporting other organizations to do those works on the front lines.
A lot of work ahead. Thank you, Aisha. Aisha talked about, Natalia and Aisha actually talked about family and the place and role of women. I'd like to turn to you, Thomas, and talk about children. SOS Village is one of those organizations that started working in Ukraine even before the current war. What has been different this time?
Thank you, Cara. First of all, bonjour and good afternoon, everyone. At the beginning, I want to thank the colleagues of Corporation Canada for inviting me here to speak, and it's a real privilege to present our work in the Ukraine and in the neighboring countries as well during this time of the war. Like you mentioned already, SOS Children's Villages has worked in the Ukraine long before the war started. Actually, SOS has been active in the Ukraine since 2003. And already during the armed conflict in the Donbas region in 2014, we have worked with humanitarian responses in government-controlled and non-government-controlled areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. And in the lead up of February 2022, so in the lead up of starting the war, our colleagues already in SOS Ukraine started evacuating staff and vulnerable families to the western part of the Ukraine. And since the war started in February 2022, with all its atrocities and all these large-scale military conflict and horrible happenings, we have seen that also our neighboring countries, so our colleagues in Poland, in Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, Latvia, Austria, Germany, all have stepped up and have taken in vulnerable families, separated or unaccompanied children into our facilities in these neighboring countries. And we know that Poland is one of the largest receivers of refugees from the Ukraine. So really, since February then, large-scale efforts from our colleagues, not only in the Ukraine, but also in the neighboring countries, to try to look at and focus in particular on women traveling with children or families with multiple children, seniors, people with disabilities, also ethnic minorities, to ensure that people and children are safe. I think one of the important factors for us was also obviously the very rapid response of global affairs for financial support for our work in the Ukraine. And since that time, we have provided over 5,000 beneficiaries a month with shelter, with non-food items, with multi-purpose cash, with food and nutritional assistance, with psychosocial support and physical and mental health support systems, and also installing child-friendly spaces, child-safe spaces, in particular for unaccompanied children or separated children, and then trying to relocate where are parents, where are the families of these children. We talked about this already, and I think we will talk about that later. We also have supported some of the African young students that were caught up in this armed conflict in the Ukraine, who unfortunately very often experienced horrendous racial discrimination in their effort to flee the country, to go to neighboring countries. So this was an additional complexities. Or we experienced ethnic minorities like Roma families that experienced racial discrimination in that time of war already. So this was another focus of our organization, trying to support these families and trying to get them out of the war zones. And I think one point also very important to mention, that the Ukraine has one of the highest rates of children living in institutional care, so in large-scale orphanages in the world, and over 60% of these children are with disabilities. And we have seen many cases where staff and care workers of these orphanages left because they were refugees themselves. They wanted to take care of their own families. So these children were left on their own. So there were huge efforts also trying to bring these kids to safe spaces, to safe areas, either in Western Ukraine or in neighboring countries where our colleagues could support. So this has kind of an evolving process, scaling up, and almost on a daily basis, we can follow it in the news, changing situation, changing areas of conflict. One day where there was an armed conflict, the war taking place, next week it wasn't taking place there anymore, and it started in another area. I remember I had a meeting with our national program director of SOS Ukraine and she was in Kiev, and she was sitting actually in her basement while the shelling of Ukraine was going on, and she was updating us on the situation. She didn't know herself where half of her stuff where half of her colleagues were at this moment. So it's a very dynamic, complex situation, which I think sometimes we, sitting here in Canada, we cannot really appreciate. But of course, Natalia sees it firsthand right now. So really wishing you best of luck, Natalia, there in this situation. I think also what has changed is that we're now faced still with an armed conflict, with a war that is going on with the internally displaced people, but many people have left and they're trying to somehow create normality back in their life without husbands, children on their own. So there's a lot of efforts trying to somehow create a normal routine. We need to look at education for children. We need to look at livelihoods. We need to look at accommodation for families, safe accommodation. We need to look at protective environments for families, in particular when it's women on their own traveling with children or now being resettled. So this has obviously evolved. This is added to this complexity of people fleeing, now trying to get somehow normality back into their lives and planning for the future. And we all know that children are the future of the country. So we're also working with the Ukrainian government to look at how can we ensure that, as I said, the children are educated, but also in the long term, how can we start planning reintegration and coming back to the country and rebuilding the country. I think kind of lessons learned, were we prepared? Can anybody be prepared for a situation like that? We've followed the news that the Russian army was building up its forces around the country, and everybody, certainly I, looked at that and thought, where is this supposed to end? Where is this supposed to go? And whilst we as SOS were in this fortunate situation to be in the country and to also work in neighboring countries, we could relatively react quickly. But I think this dimension of that war, and also the dimension of the refugees and internally displaced people, and also the dimension of the atrocities, we spoke about that, sexual violence against women and against young girls, against older people. I mean, there are stories that I think that nobody really thought would be possible in Europe. I have to say it like that. And so that's something I think that nobody was prepared for, which obviously also takes a toll on our staff members, working with displaced people, working with refugees, hearing these stories. So a lot of mental health support, psychological support needed for everybody being involved there. So I think we certainly have a lot to learn, and I think it was mentioned before, on the various levels that we're working with, to really ensure that the different players work together and the different players try to really communicate and put their efforts together in supporting all people affected by that, women, girls, families, children. And for us, it has been a huge challenge, certainly, but we're not going away, and we're there, and we continue being there.
Thank you, Thomas, for the work you are doing and your organization as well. Gabrielle, je voudrais me tourner vers vous maintenant et reconnaître déjà le travail que le Centre parlementaire fait pour soutenir le leadership mondial du Canada. Thomas vient de parler des joueurs, des acteurs sur la scène, le Canada étant l'un de ces acteurs. Quelles sont les réflexions que vous avez au Centre parlementaire concernant les obstacles à la paix? Nous sommes en plein milieu de la crise, mais les efforts sont tournés vers le retour à la normalité. Quelles sont vos réflexions sur les actions à faire et les obstacles qui demeurent pour entrevoir un retour à la normalité?
Merci beaucoup, et merci beaucoup à Coopération Canada de cette opportunité de vous parler et de partager ce panel avec des experts comme nous avons réunis ici aujourd'hui. Nous sommes très fiers d'être partenaires avec nos partenaires en Ukraine, où nous appuyons le Rada, le Parlement ukrainien, notamment sur la réforme du secteur de sécurité, avec un regard féministe. Pour moi, on parle souvent des échecs, des échecs potentiels dans les réponses internationales. Qu'est-ce qu'on aurait pu faire pour prévenir cette guerre? Pourquoi? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour mieux répondre aux crises humanitaires dont nous avons parlé dans les autres réponses. Pour moi, cette guerre, il ne faut pas oublier, c'est une guerre humaine, évidemment, mais c'était aussi une guerre sur la démocratie et les droits humains. C'est une guerre qui va déterminer le futur de ces questions dans le monde entier, non seulement en Ukraine. Et pour moi, je vois quand même beaucoup de réussite dans ce qu'on a vu aujourd'hui et beaucoup de potentiel encore pour appuyer ces objectifs de la démocratie dans le monde. Notamment, on voit une réponse internationale qui n'a jamais été vue dans la réaction bilatérale et multilatérale dans les appuis aux réfugiés, aux appels aux armements et aux appuis militaires. Déjà aux États-Unis, on a plus de 40 milliards de fonds qui ont été approuvés, je pense, juste la semaine passée. Et c'est le 6e paquet d'aide. Pareillement, au Canada, on voit un appui vraiment historique. Donc, il y a un appui, c'est parfois lent, on peut dire, mais bon, bien qu'on a vu la montée des armes autour des frontières ukrainiennes avant, c'est quand même un acte inattendu et comment dire, est très fragile. Parce qu'on joue avec un homme qui est fou, si je peux le dire, qui s'est entouré et qui s'est fait perdu dans son propre campagne de désinformation et qui est armé avec des armes nucléaires, chimiques et autres. Donc, on ne peut pas s'attendre aux réponses. Alors, pour moi, les réussites dans la diplomatie, de regarder un peu les risques que pose Poutine et avancer encore un peu, de jouer avec le temps, les réponses d'OTAN aussi sur les actions. Puis bien sûr, dans d'autres domaines aussi, on voit une harmonisation, une mobilisation dans différents secteurs qui est du jamais vu dans le dernier siècle, que ce soit le secteur privé, les entreprises qui se retirent et qui font des boycotts ou autres, que ce soit le secteur culturel qui monte une résistance incroyable dans le pays. En Russie aussi, les artistes qui mobilisent en faveur de la paix, en faveur de dénoncer les actes de Poutine, des artistes ailleurs dans le monde qui s'appuient pour la paix, pour les droits humains, et même au niveau de la communauté technologique, on voit la communauté des hackers qui trouvent des moyens incroyables. Alors pour moi, la réponse est vraiment dans ces actions-là. On voit une unification, on voit un sens de communauté internationale en faveur de la démocratie qui démontre juste à quel point on est capable de se réunir pour offrir des réponses, pour jouer dans cette situation tellement fragile et essayer de le gérer jusqu'à un fin qui est stable et qui sera à durée long terme. Et dernière chose que je dirais, c'est vraiment pour moi le cours pénal international, tout ce qui se passe au niveau de tenir la Russie responsable et pour ces crimes contre l'humanité, c'est essentiel. Et si on arrive à tenir Poutine coupable et responsable pour ses actes, c'est là qu'on va réussir à protéger notre système des droits humains, qui est le fondement de notre système depuis la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Alors, pour moi, l'architecture internationale, les institutions démocratiques, que ce soit bilatéral ou multilatéral, ils fonctionnent. Ils ont été mis à l'épreuve pendant cette guerre. Et aujourd'hui, pour moi, il y a quand même beaucoup de réussites à souligner. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Gabrielle. I'd like for us to turn to some of we've started talking about the narratives. We've talked about the silences, the forgotten aspects of the war. Let's watch a video. We'll watch 4 minutes of it. And just to give you the context, it's taken from Alain Foucault's channel, and he's talking about the racism that we've all observed at the beginning from the onset of the war. So let's watch for about 4 minutes.
Le sort des Africains dans cet enfer. Ils n'y sont pour rien, mais ils sont traités comme des animaux encore une fois. Et cela dans le silence le plus assourdissant. Pas seulement par les Ukrainiens, mais également par ceux qui clament haut et fort leur humanisme, leur solidarité. Suivez l'aventure de cet Africain qui illustre le sort qui est réservé aux Africains, aux subsahariens qui quittent l'Ukraine. Merci les Allemands.
So I crossed into the European border through the Hungarian side, the Hungarian border with Ukraine. So I had to get a ticket from Hungary straight to Berlin. And then I had a valid ticket. The chapter, the UN chapter says, hey, this countries respect human rights, so they will give us a right of passage, right? I get to Frankfurt, still on a train, and then the Bundespolice came in, they stopped our train, they were like, I don't know, 15, 20 of them with dogs. They stormed our train, they walked into my coach, said, do you have a ticket? I produced my ticket because I paid for my ticket. 100 and something, I still have the ticket in my bag, 100 and something euros. I said, okay, do you have a right to enter Germany? I said, yes, the law says refugees from Ukraine are allowed to enter. That's what the law says. I bring out my ID, my passport, and my permanent resident in Ukraine. I show them. He nods his head. He goes, he talks to his superior, and then he comes back. And he says, I have to get off the train. I'm like, for what? He says, because I wasn't born in Ukraine. I was livid. I'm like, what does that mean? I wasn't born in Ukraine. I've lived in Ukraine so long. Why would you say because I wasn't born off the train, I should get off of the train? I have a valid ticket. Why should I get off the train? I didn't stow away on the train. Why should I get off? They said, oh, we need to register you and then we can let you go. There was a German lady I met on the train. She was nice. We were having a conversation all through in English. She told me, oh, I better have to comply. That they said because I wasn't born, I have to do this. I said, they are not doing this for the Ukrainians. I also have the same rights as the Ukrainians, whether it's in Ukraine, because I'm a permanent resident. So why are you doing this? They said, because we have to register you. So we got out, all the blacks, and this was just black people, they were pulling off the train. So they took us to this holding facility. I remember the address. They took our passports. The address was in Nikola Tesla 1 in Frankfurt. It's a big warehouse. There they segment it. They have they segment the whole warehouse. So they had to keep us out in the cold for like, I don't know, hours because there were lots of us. They said we had to take COVID swabs. They took COVID swabs. They will take your passports, they will bag it, they will take all the money, they will count it, they will bag it, and then they will write on it. Yeah, this is from the Buddhist. This is one of the bags they used to bag our personal belongings. As you see, it's still the same way. The cash that was on me is still the same, unchanged, untouched. I can't even bring myself to tell because I'm still traumatized by it. My bag has a tag. This tag was from Frankfurt. They tag your bags, they tag every personal belongings you have with a yellow tag and a code. Mine was A155. And this is something they made us understand that, oh, it's just simple registration. I even asked some of the Bundespolice, oh, 1 hour maximum, we're there for 23 hours. Then the next thing I experienced was the most humiliating thing I've never experienced in my life. They took me to a room, asked me to strip naked. I had to go bare naked. They said, oh, I'm like, what's this for? They said, take off all your clothes. And then they made me squat and do a turn around, show them my ass and all that. It was so humiliating because in my life, even going through airport security, traveling, I've never experienced this. I'm like, don't you have body scanners for this? Even if you're suspecting somebody they are drugs or they are drug moles, this is not the procedure. You don't tell people to go stark naked because you want to search them. When I got to Berlin, the girl told me, hey, that thing you did there is not registration. That's your whatever. I said, this tag I have it. I brought a paper. They said, no, that's for your personal records. I've never experienced such humiliation in my life. Each time
before I hear your reactions to the video, let's take a minute to read the quote from the new humanitarian. So the quote talks about two atrocities. The first one being the impact that we've heard Natalia talk about. We've heard Thomas talk about those same, the disruptions of family, of social tie, and that's just on top of material disruption and destruction. But the second atrocity is less discussed of. It emerged in the news at some point, and it's the atrocity of racism, of discrimination, and of indifference as well. Gabrielle mentioned the unprecedented level of support, which is true and which is warranted, but at the same time, we cannot ignore the double standard in the treatment of asylum seekers, but also the level of attention given to this crisis as opposed to others, the pace of funding in this crisis as opposed to others. And now I'd like to turn to all of you. We don't have a lot of time left, but I'd like to hear from you, your reactions, both to the video and to the quote. And anyone, if you can just take a minute or two to react to those. Who would like to jump in? Thomas, go ahead. And then Gabrielle, I saw your hand. Let's start with.
Thank
yes.
you. I almost feel obliged as a German citizen myself to go first here, and I almost would like to apologize for to that young man that he had to have this experience, in particular in a country like Germany with its history and everything. So, but I think it really, what I said earlier, I think it really reflects on these different dimensions that you mentioned already, we know from history that war, armed conflicts can bring out the best in people. There are people that risk their own life to save somebody and to not think about their consequence for themselves. Unfortunately, war also brings out the worst in people, and we see this with this example. We see this with how a lot of these, and we've seen it on TV, how a lot of African students had difficulties leaving the country, had difficulties to explain their situation. As I mentioned earlier, we see the difficulties with ethnic minorities, how they are treated differently. And I think this always reminds us, and should remind us, of our responsibility, of our responsibility as humans. We are dealing with humans, regardless where you come from, regardless what your background is. To stand up for what is right and what we believe in human rights, and it is called human rights, and therefore I think it's very, very important that we highlight that. But I also think it's very important what you mentioned, Karel, the difference in media coverage, the difference in global attention to this crisis. Absolute atrocity, no doubt about it, but there is differences to other conflicts, to other crises around the world who do not receive the respective attention, where also millions of people are afflicted. So I think, again, this is something for us. We need to highlight that. We need to be aware of that. We need to speak it up. We need to speak out, and we need to, in our daily lives, really fight against every inequality and every racism wherever we meet that.
Thank you, Thomas. And really, no need to apologize on behalf of whoever in Germany did that. It's not a reflection of the German government. I leave them myself. I think Gabrielle had something you wanted to jump in. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Merci beaucoup. Je parlerai brièvement. C'est une triste réalité, et c'est une occasion quand même de reconnaître que cela existe. Et je dirais que parfois, c'est prendre des grandes crises comme celle-ci pour lever la voile sur des autres injustices qui peuvent exister dans ces contextes. Et en levant la voile, on trouve des solutions. Pour moi, il y a deux solutions importantes. La première, c'est que l'Ukraine a posé sa demande pour faire partie de l'Union européenne. Et c'est là une occasion de vraiment regarder les injustices, les inégalités, le racisme même qui peuvent exister au sein du pays. L'Ukraine, on attend de l'Ukraine qu'il respecte toutes les exigences, dont la non-discrimination dans sa demande dans l'Union européenne. Et donc, pour moi, c'est une opportunité justement dans ce milieu de démocratisation, d'ouverture vers l'Ouest, de changer ses regards. L'autre chose, c'est que l'assistance à la démocratie, comme nous faisons avec le Centre parlementaire, c'est aussi un moyen très important d'aborder ces questions et d'introduire un changement. Par exemple, dans d'autres pays, j'ai travaillé sur des campagnes d'éducation civique où, en regardant les matériaux d'éducation et en travaillant avec les autorités, on peut introduire des éléments de diversité, que ce soit des personnes, des Afro-Ukrainiens, des personnes vivant avec handicap, plus de femmes ou autre chose, dans les aspects visuels, dans l'écrit et autres. L'assistance que nous offrons à la démocratisation dans ces différents pays, on peut aborder ces questions. Et c'est vraiment une ouverture importante pour le Canada. C'est quelque chose que le Canada peut faire réellement pour améliorer la situation suite à ce conflit et même pendant le conflit. Pareillement dans les médias. C'est très rare qu'on voit des Afro-Ukrainiens dans les médias en tant que journalistes dans le pays ou même en position d'élu. Il n'y en a pas d'Afro-Ukrainiens élus aujourd'hui dans le Parlement ukrainien ou aux autres niveaux du gouvernement local. Et dans l'assistance à la démocratie que nous faisons, c'est le type de choses que nous pouvons aborder, que ce soit des formations, des sensibilisations, des appuis en parlant de ces jeunes des jeunes Africains qui viennent étudier en Ukraine ou des Afro-Ukrainiens de naissance, de les appuyer, de les inspirer, de les donner les outils que ça prend pour participer. Et c'est dans cette participation démocratique en tant qu'élu ou en tant que société civile qu'on peut changer le discours.
Merci, Gabrielle. Natalia, you wanted to say something. Natalia?
Yeah, thank you. A brief remark. I do think that the world has to hear such stories. The story of this man, and I'm sure there are many other stories like this. Thomas mentioned Roma population in Ukraine. There is a big Roma community, and the story which I heard just recently of a 15 years ago who was brutally raped by Russian soldiers because he's Roma. We need to hear more such stories. So far, these people are unfortunately silent. What we see in the media often are, politicians talking to each other, sitting at these huge tables, and this is not right. If we cannot get these people to these tables, many of us are sitting at the tables where decisions are made, right? So we have to be the voices of these people. We have to know the story and be their voice.
Thank you, Natalia. Aisha, did you want to say something?
Yes, just very quickly. So I think oftentimes when we have these conversations about racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, one of the things that comes to the surface is this idea of privilege. And I think that one of the narratives that has to be challenged every single time, as Gabrielle spoke to all of the resources that flowed in response to this war, that when we are helping others, Black people, Asian people, Indigenous people, that your privilege is not going to go away, right? The resources that can be shared amongst everybody doesn't mean that you're going to lose out. And I think sometimes the undercurrent of that is if we don't, or if we lean into actually responding appropriately to racism, that there's this loss of privilege, and that is not true. And that narrative really has to change. I think naming it, we are very diplomatic when we have these conversations. We don't name what it is, even though we talk about it. We use very eloquent terms, like we say racism, we say equity, diversity, and inclusion, but we don't name it for what it is. And oftentimes what that gentleman experiences is anti-Black racism, and that's very specific. And so sometimes we have to name it so that we can actually address it. And then lastly, if we are the ones that are at the table in these stories, we can hear these stories. We've heard them several times in several contexts for hundreds of years. And so now is the time where we actually start to respond with some accountability. It's not enough to say that we are at these tables with the decision makers. How are we going to, the ones at the table who can show up there, act? Not just be a voice, not just be a part of the conversation, but do something differently. And whether that begins with us holding someone else accountable, I don't appreciate that you're saying that. That's inappropriate to say it, and challenging and creating space when we are in a meeting having an agenda that we are trying to get through and something happens or we have these important conversations, we need to create space, not just to talk about it, and but to actually think about what the solutions are, act on those solutions, and then hold each other accountable when the processes are continuing to show up broken or ineffectively.
Thank you very much, Aisha. It's a difficult conversation, but we needed to have it. Another difficult conversation, and I want to come back to you, Natalia, because you said something important about who's at the table. We'll see another quote from this time from Beth Warniuk, who is policy lead at the Equality Fund. And she says something about the feminist foreign policy that Canada aspires to. So we'll have that quote. I'll give you a minute to read it and then we'll comment. There are many definitions of feminist foreign policy, what the type of animal that could be. Some definitions will focus on representations and rights. Activists push for focusing on more than women and girls to include men, boys, non-binary understandings of gender, recognizing intersectionality of threats, the way different threats will combine differently on people combining disability, race, class, etc. Other perspectives of feminist foreign policy emphasizes demilitarization as a core element of what it is, a feminist foreign policy. Natalia, coming back to what you said about who is at the table, with what is obvious is the very limited participation of women at those negotiation tables. Natalia mentioned, or Gabrielle, you said something about politicians talking to each other, or maybe that was you, Natalia. Are you seeing consequences of excluding women or maybe not inviting them to those negotiation tables? What are the consequences that you're observing?
Yeah, well, speaking about Ukraine, I would say that I'm a careful optimist here, very, very careful, but there is some optimism because on one side we see, honestly, we see, some Ukrainian women politicians who are at these tables and who are at front lines, making decisions, representing Ukraine in different processes, doing, everyday work, like Vice Prime Minister Stefanishina, like another Vice Prime Minister on reintegration of temporary occupied territories, Irina Vereshchuk, like, deputies of parliament, prosecutor general. So there are such women, such examples, but we need more of them. Especially at the grassroots level. And here again, I can talk from my experience of the last 100 days when I stayed in a small town in Western Ukraine. And, the first day when I came to this town, I'm an activist. So what I did, I put my suitcase and, left my family at the apartment that we were renting. And I went to the local humanitarian coordination center and offered my help. So now we are big friends with the Humanitarian Coordination Center, and the head of this coordination center is who? A woman who is doing amazing work coordinating all the humanitarian support and all the other support to IDPs living in this community. But the interesting thing that I noticed talking to my colleagues in the other regions is that the statistics here with these coordination centers is very similar to politics. The lower the level of decision making is, the more women we have. When it comes to the higher level, really where the decisions are made about humanitarian assistance, about the priorities, there are no women there. So still, who is, you know, defining their priorities? Who is making the decisions about women? Well, as always, mostly men. Another challenge that we as feminists in Ukraine see these days, another risk, is that due to all these women's perspectives might be excluded from the recovery initiative that the country is talking about now. Because when we talk to politicians about including women's rights perspective, they say, okay, we understand, we share, but let us deal with workers and then we'll come to women's rights, which means never, which means that we have to fight with this. And if we only see women as victims in this war, we will not see them as the power, as the movement, actually. They are the movement. Many of them don't know, you know, even the term civil society or feminist movement, and they don't associate themselves with feminists, but they are, because they are volunteering. They are basically those who are also saving the country and protecting the country now. So we as a movement, I think, and this is what we are doing actually with the support from Global Affairs Canada within its flagship project, Women's Voice and Leadership. We are strengthening the movement. Our strategy is to bring more women to the movement so that we are stronger and we advocate for the proper places at these tables, and also for the tables which will be convenient and friendly for us to be at. And one last thing that I wanted to say is that I wanted to recognize and thanks for the support to the Equality Fund. You showed the quote of Beth Veronique. She is a great supporter of Ukraine, she and Equality Fund also. So I wanted to thank you, to use this opportunity to thank them for continuous support to the Ukrainian Women's Fund and to Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if Beth is on the line, but we'll certainly convey those thanks to her. You talked about women. There is one Ukrainian woman, actually, Yulia Klemenko. She's a member of the Ukrainian parliament. She testified before the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture on Monday, just this Monday. And she framed, I think she gave a beautiful summary, beautiful but sad summary of the food security, the hunger crisis that is looming. And she framed it as not a collateral damage, not a collateral effect of the war, but as a weapon of war. So we are in a crisis that is where wheat is used as a weapon of war, a weapon of mass destruction. And this is a question to all of you. We only have like 5 minutes left to tackle a very big question, the food insecurity that is affecting some countries in Africa, some countries in Asia. Is it a failure of the old school approach to conflict? Is it a failure of the mainstream approaches that have accompanied our governments, our institutions for too long, to the point that today wheat can be used as a weapon of war? What are some of the questions that we're not asking enough when it comes to, and someone mentioned it, the combination of development, humanitarian, peace building work? It's not too early to start talking about development, talking about reconstruction. What are those questions that we need to address, that Canada in particular needs to tackle in its feminist foreign policy? Can I give you a minute to answer this huge question? Gabrielle, est-ce que vous voulez commencer?
Allez, pourquoi pas. Effectivement, c'est une question essentielle. Depuis longtemps, je suis du point de vue que l'agenda femmes, paix et sécurité ne se termine pas à la fin des négociations, ça ne fait que commencer. Et que vraiment, les processus de démocratisation, c'est aussi essentiel. Il faut que les voix des femmes soient entendues, non seulement pendant les négociations, mais aussi dans les phases de transition, et cela à tous les niveaux. Là, on est devant un défi important. Il n'y a pas de femmes sur les équipes de négociation aujourd'hui, des deux côtés. Bien que l'Ukraine a fait des pas importants dans la représentation des femmes avant la guerre, il reste encore beaucoup à faire. Alors, pour moi, ça c'est vraiment l'essentiel. Et s'il n'y a pas les voix, les perspectives, l'expertise des femmes à tous ces échelles de décision, il n'y aura pas de réponse pour répondre à ces besoins qui ont un point de vue féministe, qui ont un impact féministe très important. Et je suis très inquiétée par l'approche, le FIAP, l'approche féministe sur l'assistance internationale au Canada, parce que il y a comme un vide sur les questions de la démocratie. Qu'est-ce que c'est qu'une approche à l'assistance à la démocratie qui est aussi une approche féministe? Et cela reste à définir et ça reste un des priorités pour le Canada dans les mois à venir.
Merci, Gabrielle. Thomas, another minute to you.
Perhaps I will jump in. Oh,
go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead, Aisha.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. No,
I will
please,
jump
go
in
ahead.
quickly. You asked the question, what are the questions we are not asking? And I think there's a lot I can speak to. Kairos has submitted some, concerns and recommendations around the feminist foreign policy. I won't speak to that, but what is the question we should ask? I think the main question is why? Why are women not there? And so, a really high level short list, we need to ask questions, why are they not there? And when I think of the why they're not there, I think of everything from building capacity to being very intentional about increasing their participation to ensuring that there is protection for women that they need and the resources and services, to challenge the discrimination practices and to enforce accountability. And I think those are some of the questions that we need to ask. How do we do those things? How are we intentional about that? But the big question is why. And if we really look to that question why, we'll get all of the answers. And then the follow through is then, what do we need to do to address these gaps? How do we continue to build the capacity? How do we ensure that there is participation? How do we make sure that they are protected when not only from some of the things that Natalia spoke to as women are responding on the front lines and being subject to violence, it's not just physical violence. When we sit around boardrooms, there's other types of violence that we are, that is inflicted upon us, mental, emotional. We can't show up in the fullness of who we are, and the fullness of who we are women, and that is what we're bringing to these tables. And the invitation is not often there for us to show up in the fullness of what we are going to bring to those conversations. So I think we need to challenge the discrimination and also enforce accountability around all of those tables and every area where women need to be a part of this conversation. Our societies are not made up of only one type of person, and so we need to get past the point of consulting and thinking that when that consultation is done, that what's going to be brought into those meetings is going to be translated well. That doesn't work. And so we need to be at those tables and recognized as being important and integral to the conversations that need to happen and the development of those policies.
Thank you, Aisha. Natalia, we started with you. I'd like to give you the opportunity to close. If there's one thing you would like to tell to all of us.
Yeah, well, I have a question regarding the answer to your question. My question would be, who is developing these policies and why women from the grassroots level, or not why, are there enough, but is there enough participation of women from grassroots level in these strategic conversations? And with this, I wanted to thank you again for the opportunity to be with you together and to be at this table today.
Thank you very much to all of you, each one of you, for making the time. It was not an easy conversation, but it was a conversation worth having, and it's not the end, unfortunately. At this point, we'll take a group picture, if you don't mind. So my colleague Darren will make sure we have a nice smiley picture, although the context is not necessarily joyful, but let's be hopeful and smile for the picture. Darren, just let us know when you're ready.
I think Rita is going to take the picture. Rita, can you go right ahead? Great. I think we all look very good on that. It's all done.
Thank you. Now, over to you, Kate, for your closing remarks.
Well, just my sincere thanks for a really provocative, interesting, thoughtful, reflective conversation today. Natalia, thank you so much for joining us. And our hearts and thoughts are with you and your family and your organization as you do this really hard work. Aisha, Gabrielle, Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. Karel, merci beaucoup. Madame modératrice, c'était super. Thank you all for being here and sharing this space. Cooperation Canada really appreciates your participation, your engagement, your interest, and we sincerely hope that we can continue this conversation with all of you. So thank you, and I wish you all well.
Thank you. All the best, Natalia.
Merci beaucoup à vous tous.
Thank you.